I wanted to say a few words about my connection to Mark Nickerson. He and I didn't know each other before 1954, in spite of being colleagues and having similar political background and worldview in many ways. We were thrown together by the beneficent administration of the University of Michigan, and had a similar fate at that point. Number 2 in the Nickerson brood and number 1 in the Davis brood were both on the scene and about the same age. And they're both here this afternoon, Mike Nickerson and Aaron Davis. And a couple of other Davises there in back. And not relevant to the subject of this afternoon's talk, but something that's very relevant to his life. Mike and Aaron, at about the same time, got interested in farming sustainably, living on the earth as if we meant to stay here. And they both moved to Eastern Ontario to implement this, and had a wonderful time, a very fulfilling time. Mike stuck with it. Aaron didn't get disenchanted with it, but he spent his professional life mostly in music, roaming the world. And nevertheless, I feel that there's more of an affinity between the Davises and the Nickersons than appears on the surface. Mike, would you like to take over for a bit?
Okay, well, I'm pleased to have an opportunity to say a few words. I don't know if you know, we sort of got moved out of the other hall, so I didn't get to talk to the bigger audience. This is a bit of a shame, but I don't really remember anything. I don't remember anything of the time back here. I was 3½. My brother was twice that age and got accosted on the way to school and needed a police escort. He doesn't remember a thing. My sister was in my mother's tummy and is just horrendously afraid of the entire thing. She has no knowledge of it, but it all makes us creepy. So that's the effect on the family of the traumas that our parents went through as we escaped the country to a new life in Canada, which has been a good place. I'm a little wary of the United States, but not as badly as some of us. My dad worked really, really hard to reestablish himself. He was told when he was dismissed by, I think Severs was his department head, was the chair. He was told that I will make sure that you never work as a pharmacologist again. And he worked very, very hard to make sure that that wasn't true. And when the department, or the some association of pharmacology and therapeutics established an award for excellence in pharmacology and therapeutics, and when he received that award, he got the first one. They said, we can't give this to anybody else unless you get one first. And he invited Severs to that award ceremony, and he didn't come, but he somehow felt vindicated. I can't talk to academic freedom. I can't spell, and I can't remember names, and I don't remember dates. It's been a problem all my life. I can research those, find them, put them down. I've done 3 books, and it works out okay. But I still have nightmares about exams, and I haven't been an academic since grade 12. But I'm passionately interested in cultural evolution. How does society change? And ever since I got out of high school, I've been looking for anything I can find on the way in which societies change. And very quickly, I discovered the whole raft of environmental issues. This is the early 70s, starting to come on, where the people observing the world and the human relationship to it are saying, whoa, we're seriously affecting this finite planet, which we just learned was finite. Like, we knew for a long time, but the photographs were just showing up so you could say, look at it, it's round, there's no more. So I studied that a lot, and what I do have in replacement of all the names and labels of things is I see the patterns. And in my books I work very hard on, you understand this pattern, look for it in this more complex situation. And I think that it's a blessing that I don't know what the parts are called, because if I saw the parts, they didn't look the same. They got different parts. They're named different things. But the one that I'd like you to consider is the parallel between our individual metabolism and the economy of our society. As an individual, your gut gives you nutrients, your brain gives you directions, your muscles give you motion, your lungs give you air, your blood is circulating. All these systems work together in your metabolism to make you an integral human being. In society, some people grow food, some people build structure, some people educate people. So people are doing all sorts of different things. And money circulates through the system in the economy. We have the metabolism as a society, our economy, we have the metabolism of a child. It's based on growth. And we are growing to overwhelm our planet. And that's a huge problem. And where this intersects with the topic of these discussions is, I think it's South Carolina and Florida. As a public servant, it is against the law for you to utter the words climate change, which is just one of the manifestations of human beings overwhelming our planet. But you can't say it. In Canada, our publicly funded scientists are not allowed to talk about their work without clearance from the government. Because if they say we're having problems with these issues of climate, which of course the government that we currently have, or hope to get rid of soon, is dedicated to exploiting this enormous carbon thing in Alberta, the tar sands. And so they've just been suppressing interaction, explanations from scientists on these things. Anyway, so we've got the metabolism of a child as a society. All of our experience for hundreds, thousands of years has been that expansion is a good thing. And if the economy's not growing, we have hard times. People lose jobs, businesses go bankrupt. We have all sorts of things that come of it. But what we have to understand is it's not because we have to grow. It's because that's the way the economic structure is set up. And the challenge that all of you are facing, your children and your grandchildren will increasingly face as we move into the future, is how do we accept as a civilization a mature role? Where we realize that yes, there's only so much room for human activity on this planet. And we need to bring our physical, our material interactions within the bounds of those limitations. Now everybody here has reached a mature size and we stop physically growing. That's a good thing, and it happens automatically as individuals, thank goodness. Because if we were growing like 4-year-olds, we'd be very quickly in other sorts of trouble. In our society, we have no precedent, so it's a real challenge to try to figure out how do we, first of all, recognize that we're grown up. Anybody who's raised teenagers, sometimes they just like the fact that they've always been taken care of and they get everything given to them, and it's, how do you make the break into, you've got to take care of yourself now. But almost every individual does. A civilization made up of individuals who's accepted adult responsibility should be able to accept it as a civilization, and hopefully there'll be some sort of repercussions on that nature too. That sort of thing. Anyways, that's what I know. Yes, we're going into questions later, so we can take it from there.
I was just wondering whether those people standing could squeeze by and sit down, but I probably didn't want to make noise while people were talking. But now would be good if you can.
Can we ask questions as we go along?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Peggy, do you want to call on people? Or?
Yes. Did someone have their hand?
My one question to you is the censoring of information in Canada just scientific? Is it just on environment, or is it all scientific information? Is it all?
No, all governmental.
Government scientists, anybody who's supported by government funding, is not allowed to talk to the public or the press without having what their topic is vetted in the Prime Minister's office.
Okay, I don't know about the South Carolina situation. I know it's not a good place to be, but I do know about the Florida situation, and that is the governor of Florida has told the people who work in government in Florida that they may not use the word anything to do with the environmental changes that are taking place, and they'll lose their jobs. They're told they lose their jobs. But there's no law or anything like that.
Maybe it's just intimidation.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I could add to what Mike has said. It takes two forms in Canada. One is closing laboratories, which are producing information which is used, or discarding and destroying information which has been collected. And the most glaring example, perhaps, is the Experimental Lakes program, but it's far from the only thing. And the second thing is the obliging of scientists in certain scientific areas, especially those related to climate change, forbidding them to make any public statement without clearing it with their superiors, which in most cases means not making it at all. Now, of course, this results in certain number of resignations from the labs that survive, but the government doesn't mind that.
Okay. Any other questions for anyone now? It's open. Over here.
Thank you very much for everybody for their comments. And I want to, I mean, actually, I have two, can I make two brief comments there? The first one is, it's not limited to climate change. There was an article this morning about James Comey of the FBI saying that it's frustrating to him that he can't get any information about police shootings that's from government sources that's more accurate than what he can get from The Guardian. Because of laws restricting the ability of people at CDC to treat shootings as a public health issue. They're not allowed to use taxpayer money to do those kinds of studies. Anyway, I want to ask a harder question to Joan.
This is a conversation that's been going on for a long time.
I really, really appreciated your talk enormously. And in part because of the history that you told, I think it's very important about the way in which the debate about hate speech on campuses developed in the 1980s and where we are now. And that was very important to lay out in the very precise ways that you did. But I wanted, one thing that you didn't say, which I want to sort of query, is that at the moment, the people who were saying that speech is an action, and actions are hurtful and speech can never be hurtful, and we need to, was presented by people like Stanley Fish, who were basically arguing that there is not really such something we can call free speech. Free speech is simply, this is his argument, something that's left over after you've already decided what you don't want to hear, right? And his idea was that the people who are advocating some kind of intervention in order to decide what is a kind of acceptable form of interaction in various contexts, at least allows for a certain politics to take place that we weren't having by simply saying, because freedom, because free speech, right? So there, in a sense, the argument at the time, was precisely the argument that Judith Butler and yourself were making, that we are not having a broader discussion about what the politics of discrimination or right. And so there was a kind of convergence of goals to make a politics come forth. The story that you tell is a story about the consequences of that. Anyway, I just thought I would throw that out.
I mean, I think that's right, and I think that the critical race theory people are right that speech and the harm it does is the embodiment of the structures of discrimination that people are living. And the point was to say, this is how we're living those structures. But but even in that period, there's the argument, because the Butler stuff is written in that period. Skip Gates' stuff is from that period. So there's already anxiety about what it could mean to focus too much on harm and on speech. But I think what's happened now is that entire argument has been, that argument is no longer there, and the entire the thrust of what was meant to happen has now been co-opted into a completely different conversation. That's the problem. Then it functioned to point to the ways in which people were experiencing things. Now, that's all we have is individual experience and harm. And the attempts to turn it, and it's not that there aren't attempts to turn it into questions about structures and policies that promote or allow this kind of discrimination. But it's hard to hear it. It's not heard in the framework that has been established by the court cases, by the universities, by these others, in which only individual harm can be heard or seen, and the structures that it, in fact, often embodies are eclipsed or effaced by the way the conversation takes place. The question is how you get that heard beyond and how the people who are invoking it, because that's the other side of the problem. When you're forced to plead pain, wounds, Wendy Brown stuff from the 80s and 90s about wounded states of injury, about wounded attachment, and identity politics. I mean, that's where the first critique comes of the notion of wounded victims of these situations. But the question is how to keep the focus on individual embodiment and yet turn it into the basis for political movements and collective action, rather than redress either in the courts or in some small way in the university, or as a lesson in empathy, which those diversity workshops used to try to do. Really hurts me when you say that.
Over here.
Okay, I'll go first. Yeah.
Well, you're older.
Yes, all I was going to say, a good example. I think it's interesting the way people can actually respond. They kind of glaze over when there are institutional inequalities and injustices. But when people are faced with individual cases, they're able to understand it. And a good example is the Syrian refugee crisis, which was sort of turned on its head by one picture of a dead child on the beach, and a lot of people who were, Syrian refugees have been dying
for a long
years,
time,
and in trucks. But one picture, one individual case enabled people to understand it. I think that Mike's talking about how do people change? How do they change their attitudes towards things? Often it seems that without some sort of an individual case like that, people can be incredibly callous, institutionally. They can have political opinions that are very kind of cold, and then when faced with an individual situation, they can all of a sudden become much more warm and embracing.
But the question is how to sort of turn the individual into the political. I even think in the case, I was just in Sweden, and I went to a demonstration to welcome refugees. And there were all kinds of wonderful banners that said all the things I identified with. Capitalism causes war. There's no such thing as a refugee, or I can't remember what the notion of state sovereignty creates the notion of refugee. There's only the human, that kind of stuff. But okay, so the banners had what I would think of as political analysis, some of them. All the speeches were about empathy. All the speeches were about how we have to feel for these people. We have to, but nobody asked us in this crowd to do anything. I mean, the rally was apparently held because the mayor of Lund, which was the town I was in, was reluctant to accept refugees, whereas Sweden overall has been very welcoming and Malmö, the town down the road, has been taking them in from Denmark and so on. But there wasn't a single speech which said, let's march on City Hall, the mayor has to do something. It was all about, we have to feel for these people, we have to help them, we have to like them. And I kept thinking, where is the call to political action of some kind? Where is the analysis that will move us from an understanding of the terrible plight of these people to something else, or some other understanding of what produced this nightmare? It's not just a bad guy in Syria. I mean, there's a whole geopolitical, and you can't have a whole geopolitical analysis, but at a rally, why not? There were, and from the geopolitical analysis should follow certain kinds of actions that could could be taken. So I think your example is right, that there are people whose minds can be changed by the example of an individual whom they empathize with. But how do you move from the empathetic reply to an insight into what Butler calls those larger institutional structures that produce and confirm the speech that we want to refuse or criticize in the first place?
The civic, you talk so interestingly about homo economicus or femina economica, and the erosion of a civic, along with the empathy, along with the personal, the erosion, the need for the erosion of a civic sense and a deep political sense. I had one thing I wanted to ask that relates partly to your interchange with Professor Cole?
Josh.
And perhaps also picks up on Aaron's point about the individual. In some of these cases that you cited, it's clear that individual women, perhaps, actually felt personally offended.
Oh, yeah.
In others, and I'm thinking of the Saleta case at the University of Illinois, there was an adoption of the language of discomfort by students who were going to have nothing to do with Saleta ever.
Right.
There was no, they were not in his field, they had nothing to do with it. And it had been, evidently either for reasons of what works in law, was thought to work in law, or what has been part of a discourse, this was what was picked up in these mass emails, that we will be heard. So there, whereas in fact it was something that was orchestrated institutionally.
Yeah, and
so
by a political lobby.
I think that perhaps speaks to the power of this, either that it works legally, or under Title IX, or the power in American civic sensibility of this kind of very, this argument of
comfort and security.
Well, and perhaps I think that your point that this goes along with the notion of the consumer, rather than the. I don't meet the students. The students I meet are just full of intellectual excitement, and I don't meet these kind of students. It's wrong.
Yeah, really, I'm also really connecting with this. I do meet some of the students who talk about feeling almost with the sense of the consumer's right to feel comfortable, and to feel safe. But I want to just sort of take a minute and think about, it emerges out of, if you go back to the beginning of the language about wanting to feel safe, it goes back to kind of some hard-won battles about, as you mentioned in your talk, about kind of like trying to carve out a space in an institution that has absolutely relegated all concerns about affect to, that's kind of petty-waist concerns that shouldn't even be brought into the context of a serious classroom. So, and then now it's come to a completely different era with the therapeutic state. But my question is, this whole issue of creating an environment where certain language begins to be censored again in the name of comfort and safety, gets played out in a lot of different arenas, but one of them is indeed the classroom. And so you have to start asking, well, what is a pedagogy that would allow us to think about, and this is my question for you, what is a pedagogy that would allow us to say, maybe it's not comfort and safety that we want, nor is it sort of this a kind of discourse that would actually exile emotion from the room, but rather something, you've heard those phrases about not safe but safe enough, and also about the benefits of discomfort and difficult dialogue, and sort of like, so that rather than saying we shouldn't have an emotional environment in this, which of course isn't your point, but that politics is over here and emotion is over here, how can you have a pedagogy where there's the possibility for reflecting seriously on how can we have difficult dialogues together? And it seems to me that is, you're talking about academic freedom, but what does it mean to be free together? And it's not going to be comfortable. So
I think you've answered your own question. That's the pedagogy we have to. I don't have the answer specifically, but I think it's in the classrooms that we're in. those of us who are still in them, that in those classrooms, that's the kind of thing to be aiming for, to sort of refuse the attempt to shut down conversation in the name of discomfort, and to sort of argue instead that this is a place where we can be uncomfortable together.
Well, how can we make it quote unquote safe enough to be uncomfortable, rather than just say, don't be safe because now we're being difficult?
Right.
It just seems like there's got to be a way to be safe enough.
But I think that's communicated by the way the professor behaves.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when I was a graduate student, I used to teach for George Mossey at the University of Wisconsin.
Oh, wow.
And he would start his intellectual history lectures by saying, in his, I can't imitate the accent, but it was this, wonderful accent, and he'd say, now, I know many of you in this class are Christian and you're believers. You are going to question that belief if I have any impact on you. And then he would say, and then he'd look at us, the graduate students, and he'd say, and I know many of you are leftists and Marxists, and you too are going to question your beliefs. If you're and he did it in sort of good humor, but it happened. We would have, the TAs would have, you'd have a kid in class who'd come to you and say, I'm having a religious crisis, I can't go home, and then you'd have the Marxist saying, oh my God, not converting, but trying to figure out where they stood. I mean, I think there's something about the person of the pedagogue or the teacher that makes it possible, that is reassuring at the same time that they're promising to shake you up.
And he's a good model for those who talk about civility.
Yeah.
Because George Mossey was a beloved teacher, and yet he did.
No civility.
No, civility was not.
I appreciated Bo's talks so much, so thank you again, Natalie and Joan, for what you've done for us. This conversation reminds me, as faculty chair, we are right now engaged in rewriting our professional standards policy here at the University of Michigan, which in its present state is incomprehensible. And incomprehensible policies are bad because in case of conflict, they get interpreted by general counsel who works for the regions. So we are working on one that's a little clearer, perhaps, than the one we have. And what we've discussed is the need for a clear distinction between an ethical obligation and actionable behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very important to keep this clear that yes, I do think the university in general as a community has a legitimate interest that people aren't assholes, to put it bluntly, but and treat each other as well as can be expected while having passionate disagreements, right? But that the university should only be able to discipline its community members when they actively and demonstrably and according to a reasonable person standard interfere with somebody else's ability to pursue their responsibilities. And I think this distinction between ethical obligation, which we can impose on ourselves as autonomous human beings, and a disciplinary apparatus is really important.
It'd be interesting to see how you spell that out.
Yeah, I could use help. I mean, we SAC here could use a lot of help, so anybody who has any ideas about this, please email. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah, I want to ask you to think about the connection between civility and academic freedom in the domain which you so admirably described in the lecture, and the realm of social media. A lot of the issues that have come up have been professors being idiots in social media, expressing themselves. But also the social media world is not exactly civil. If you ever get onto Yik Yak, which I haven't, but it's an anonymous world of university students doing nasty things to each other. You read the comments sections on online publications. There seems to be this licensing of sometimes extreme aggression.
Right.
I study South Africa and I read South African newspapers, and the biggest publisher in South Africa has recently shut down the comments section online because of the extraordinary racism that was expressed there, which I had never experienced or heard or in real life. But you see this flourishing of these zones. So I wonder if you could just connect what you've argued about civility and the role of that discourse within the university context with this other world that is getting kind of
out of control. I don't know what I mean. I haven't thought enough about it. I don't think and I haven't lived online enough in that world to think about it. I think it's a really, and not only in the level of higher education, but in the high schools and schools as well. The bullying that takes place online, the suicide, the kids who taunt each other about committing suicide. I mean, it's. I don't know how to address that.
I actually have I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just have a little comment. This comes up a lot. I live in Los Angeles, and it's kind of a media place, as you might imagine. So this comes up a lot. I interview actors often, and they have a lot. I encounter a lot of. I hear a lot of stories about the comments that they get from them, because they're very public. So we talk about speech. There is a chilling effect of those kinds of comments. And I talk to people who don't want to express an opinion about anything that can be shared. Anything. And actually, I think about Chandler Davis, Mark Nickerson, and Clement Margaret, who just weren't afraid to stand by something they believed in. And it dovetails with my own remarks about how much they inspired me as a young guy, and continue to. Because they are three examples. I mean, and I'm not talking about comments about, a TV show maybe or a gossipy thing, but things that people really do hold to or feel strongly about. And so I bring this back maybe to the film a little bit, but I think it is a document of courage, and to hold an opinion or take a position that was not embraced by everybody.
I'd like to comment on that, because I was extraordinarily interested in it as over time, both in the rhetoric of high school and grade school, having heard about it from in regard to grandchildren, that extraordinarily very strong rhetoric, and then following through on whenever I've looked at these trails of comments, and being very struck by what seemed the irresponsibility and extravagance. And I got interested in it historically because I've done a lot of work on popular criticism, the traditions in, say, Rome of anonymous satires. There were all kinds of ways in which satirical poems, very violent, and all the work that I've done on popular uprisings and court cases or during carnivals, very violent and extreme. But the difference there, really quite very insulting, sometimes leading to court cases and to violence in response. A number of the murder cases that I've gotten of killing in hot anger came from extremely insulting, sometimes general remarks. The difference, over time anyway, is that these poems, these anonymous things where people hoped not to be held responsible, were ritualized in some way. There became patterns, places that you put things, or times in which it was done. I'm not trying to, there was a kind of pattern that kept them under reasonable control, and people learned from other people. I'm not sure what this leads up to, except that there's this explosion of anonymous, often explosion. I don't know what's going to happen over it. Sometimes you actually see people imitating other people or imitating things that they've heard on television. So there is a pattern emerging, and maybe there would be ways in which people, besides closing down these things, which is one solution, people who are have lots of followers, people like Mark and Edwin, people who have lots of tweeters, whatever, might really take seriously trying to set up patterns of rhetoric. I mean, there's billions of people who are doing this, but patterns of rhetoric, or something that might reflect the experience of the ritual of carnival, or the ritual of Purim. In Purim you drink and you can insult and do all kinds of crazy things. You do it until you can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Mortimer. You go so far that it ends, that the disputes end. And it may be that some things, that people that are involved in this world of communications or might really try to set tones that allow for expressiveness, but that somehow keep them. Do you say?
But don't you think that it's the problem now is that it's one-on-one?
Yeah.
That whereas
these other things were more collective.
These are collective civic rituals of one kind or another and expressions, and now what you're getting is even though a lot of people read them, it's one-on-one. It's you're targeted by me.
Well, there are some of these people who have huge followings, though.
Okay, we have just one more question, and we have to, I think,
Go ahead.
let our.
Okay, sorry, well, this was just a couple comments back, but it's, what I would want to just underscore, and I don't just, again, I'm not sure quite where this goes, I just know it's very much on my mind when I try to think about these things and engage in classroom practices that are responsive to the concerns that have been raised, is the generational difference. So the children who are not really children, but rather young adults in our classrooms here, have not grown up in the same world. And again, I don't want to peg anyone in a particular generation, but I worry sometimes about what can sometimes feel a bit nostalgic in thinking about a world of possible discursive exchange that is not the world that our students know. Maybe it could be, maybe it should be, maybe we can encourage it. I had a pleasure conversation earlier. I'm all for encouraging discomfort. That's where learning happens, but a toleration for that seems critical. And the social media piece, I just want to signal is, I'm not going to try to figure out how old we all are, but a world mediated through unregulated discursive exchange at any moment of the day or night, that your social circles, that your sense of well-being, in-group, out-group, normal developmental dynamics filtered through language. It's not just the ones that make the headlines, the horrific, unbearable cases of suicides, falling, bullying, right? And this is like an everyday phenomenon. So my sense when students come from a number of different perspectives is, what is this world they live in? Because I don't want to make any assumptions about what it is. Part of that world, just point to and then I'll shut up, is a world in which public violence, shootings on schools is a part of their reality in a way that it is not for our generation. I'm not saying we didn't know violence. I'm not saying that there isn't all kinds of violence for political demonstrations, but a felt experience of embodied vulnerability that so many of our students, and frankly, when you get up in front of a large lecture room and start saying things that you know are going to piss a lot of them off, on the part of the teacher, it's a different world. So part of me wants to just duck and cover, but part of me wants to sort of say, okay, what is this, not just institutional, not just neoliberal, but also speech practices and rhetorical forms and technologies that change their world in a way that I don't know what to do with it, but I just want to never lose sight of those generational.
But it must have patterns. I mean, it must have patterns to it in different clusters of places. What is it?
Geographic place? I mean,
No.
Well, there must be patterns. You're speaking of violence, the things that are emerging in this welter of communication.
No doubt there are patterns, but.
Well,
I guess
we
what I'm
know
saying
that
is the kinds of things that would feed language practices, senses of harm, of what is harming and what is not. It feels to me like the discursive universe and the well-armed American public, I'm exaggerating, together create a world in which our student children are living that is just really so very different than what many of us know. And being sensitive to that. Sensitive, what the hell is that? Being aware that I don't know what that experience is something that I encounter every day in the classroom.
Could we thank our